Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. Changing Higher Ed is sponsored by Blackbaud, the world's leading cloud software company powering social good. With their cloud solution for higher education, Blackbaud connects thousands of campuses worldwide. Visit blackbaud.com/highered to learn how they can help your institution deliver a better experience. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our special guest today is Dr. Mary Wardell-Ghirarduzzi. She's a seasoned executive leader and author who is skilled at building strategic higher education capacity in academic affairs, student life, community engagement, and diversity, equity, inclusion. She currently serves as the Vice Provost for Diversity, Engagement, and Community Outreach at the University of San Francisco, where she also teaches, and also serves as the President of the San Francisco Public Library Commission. Mary is very well known for the work that she's done in the area of race, diversity, and leadership, and she advises multiple university presidents on how to create an environment of equity and diversity. She has won the Most Influential Woman Award by the San Francisco Business Times, and her first book, Twice as Good: Leadership and Power for Women of Color, examines the intersection of race and gender in organizations. Today's topic may be a bit uncomfortable for a lot of folks. It certainly was for me, and I grew up in Panama, an international country where we had a very diverse community, and especially in our schools. Having said that, it's a topic that we must look at as higher ed leaders and ensure that we're doing the right thing by all people by rooting out the unconscious biases that we have and treating all with respect, dignity, and compassion that we all deserve. Well, Mary, welcome back to the show. It's great to see you again.
Oh, thank you so much, Drum. It's so great to be here again as well.
Gosh, it's been a year since we got together last. And, I would hate to say that we were prophetic with our last session, but frankly, I think we were because so many things have happened since then.
The world has become a place of open pain and suffering. And at the same time, it's become a place where people are asking more questions. People who are curious are asking more questions around how do we get here? And even more so, where do we go next? So my work in higher education, but particularly since I've been leading from the diversity strategic platform in helping presidents and provosts and deans, senior leaders build their own equity and inclusion capacities. So much of what we need to do is not so much focused on what we need to do next, even though that is a very real thing that we have to do. But I've really been trying to hold spaces for people to think about how do we get here. So that's the work that we have to do in higher education and understanding deeply how do we get to this place.
Well, I think you're absolutely right with that. If you talk to any therapist, if you talk to people who really look at organization behavior, you need to understand how we got here to be able to heal. So how did we get here?
That is such a complex question, and it's simple at the same time, which are sometimes some of the best things to try to address, because there's a lot of complexity to a very simple issue. And from the simple issue is that there is a way in which we were constructed as a country, as a nation of people that has left a stain in regard to how we went about it. And oftentimes we glorify what one does, but we know those of us that pay attention to organizations is just as important as how you go about doing things. And so the construction of, the nascent nation and the young United States was done on the backs of an enslaved group of individuals, an enslaved people. And furthermore, it was further expanded on the genocide of an indigenous people that were physically in the North America. And when you put together those two events, which in many ways continue to have continued on, and obviously we see the impacts today, that the economic capital, the cultural capital, and all of the capitals, social capitals that makes the United States the nation that it became, that all of that was really built on the backs of these enslaved individuals, and as well as the contributions, if you want to call it contributions, or the ways in which indigenous people were removed so that expansion can happen. And if you look at the laws, if you look at all of the social institutions, higher education, our banking, financial systems, all of our housing, our healthcare systems, everything that you look at that contributes to this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the laws, and then the legislation that enacts the laws, and then the policies that enact those, all of the institutions, whether it's universities or any of those other industry leaders, all had to make decisions about how they were going to participate in this young nation and be a part of that construction that fundamentally marginalized large groups of people, in this case specifically Black people and indigenous people. And we know that marginalization didn't stop with those two groups. We continue on. We know that early on, the Chinese Exclusion Act was a result of white communities who felt that Chinese immigrants were taking their employment. And even well before the Chinese Exclusion Act went into effect, there had been a series of legislation that had come before Congress. We know about the internment of people, Americans of Japanese ancestry, as being seen as potential sympathizers with a nation that many of them were no longer even associated with outside of having an ancestry and as American citizens, and how they were incarcerated. And we know that this whole, after the Reconstruction, the failure of Reconstruction after the Civil War, how the states had the ability to decide how they were going to treat and enact policies that would then become what we knew now as the Jim Crow laws, that were actually worse to people of Black descent in some ways as much as slavery was, although this came after the Emancipation Proclamation. All those things are just a continual enactment of what happened in 1619, when the first enslaved peoples of African descent came to the nascent colonies to help build this country. So how does all of that, make sense to where we're at today? Basically, we've built a nation that has not been true to the very ideals that we've had, and we've done it in a way that has always marginalized a group of people in all of our institutions. And the reason why I keep talking about institutions, because institutions are really important. They're the social fabric that makes up society. People go to a house of worship, if we were not in COVID-19, on a Sunday or whenever they would do that. People go to universities. People belong to banks. People have associations where they live. So we have all these social institutions that we have that makes up a community, that makes up a state, that makes up a nation. And in every single one of these social institutions, even the more recent ones, such as technology firms, they all have this kind of hidden and unconscious and sometimes conscious forms of racism that the protesters in the street are talking about now. They're saying it's not just individualized forms of racism that goes all the way back to 1619. It actually is about the way that we have engaged in institutionalized forms of racism. And so when we think about how do we get here, it really does begin there in those early stages of how we came together as a nation. And if higher education is one of the core social institutions in the United States, which it is and has always been an essential institution in the United States, higher education also has its roots that would mirror the rest of the other social institutions.
That makes perfect sense that it would. You hit on a number of key areas right there. One of is you call unconscious racism or unconscious bias. We're all guilty of it, aren't we?
Yeah, we're all guilty of it. And the thing, though, around unconscious bias is that because we're all guilty of it, and because unconscious bias is focused on the individual, by focusing on unconscious bias, what happens is that it becomes a way to explain and perhaps even not engage personally in one's personal responsibility in the forms of institutionalized racism that exists today. And that's one of the things that I talk about when I do talk about unconscious bias, because people will say exactly what you said, Drum, and somehow or another that gives them a pass on the realities of people that are experiencing in these social institutions. And since this audience is an audience of people who are both stewards of these of the institutions of higher education today, that type of response, while we're all guilty of it, does not hold water for people who have responsibilities of duty and stewardship. Those individuals' response to issues of unconscious bias is rather to understand the complexities of institutionalized racism. And unconscious bias is just the way it shows up in the modern day form, that we make decisions that we have biases to that are not known to us, but they still exist even though they're not known to us. We have processes that we have a perspective that is implicit to some biases that we have, but yet it doesn't mean that the bias is not felt by the very individuals that you're seeking to serve. And so this idea of unconscious bias and implicit bias, yes, it is accurate and it is true, and it focuses on the ways in which individuals may have these blind spots. And at the same time, though, people that are in leadership roles, whatever those leadership roles they actually have a much higher standard. They have a much higher responsibility to settle into the fact that they have unconscious biases. As a matter of fact, they have a higher responsibility to figure out, what is it that I do not know? What is it that I do not understand? What about my leadership that is causing me to stumble in ways that are not even clear to me, but it is clear to others that I have to somehow or another, what I call learn to unlearn, so that I might be able to relearn. So there's three things that need to happen: that you have to learn new things, and once you start learning new things, then you're going to be confronted that you're going to have to unlearn some things that you actually learned that are actually problematic to the leadership, to one's personal leadership. That means that it's problematic to the institution if they're the institutional leader. And then they have to relearn so that they might be able to respond in the appropriate way in their leadership practice for the needs of their community today.
So understanding that there is unconscious bias, unconscious racism, and then looking at it to find out where those blind spots are, what you're saying is really the first step.
It is definitely the first step. You know, I like to do an exercise when I do learning sessions, building capacity, equity, capacity building sessions for leaders, whether it be an inclusive leadership session, and I will always talk about microaggressions as a modern day form of racism and how it shows up, because we have heard that so often from our students as well as our faculty and staff, particularly those of color, to help them understand how that works and to help people understand how unconscious bias works. That's just the manifestation of the institutionalized form. But the real work for the leaders, I tell them, is this. Their work is to do that kind of interior reflection around understanding who they are in relation to their racialized identity, to the issues that they're seeking to lead or respond to. presidents or provosts have a whole group of people that are on their cabinets, on their teams, who are responding in real time as they are responding in real time. But one of the things that I always caution them in their response is that you're going to have to create space, particularly now in 2020, that although we're all smart people and we're all trained to respond, that you actually have to pause long enough so that you can do some what I call discernment work. And the discernment work that leaders in higher education have to do right now is to understand their own racial formation. How did I understand race as a child? And when was the first time that I interacted with an African American or Black person? What was my school like? Did I have Black children in my classroom? When was the first time that I had a Black teacher? What grade was I? Who taught me about race? What was the perspective of those individuals around race in America? Where was I raised? What zip code did I grow up in? How did my neighborhood influence my current ideas around race? Who did I marry? Who was on my wedding invitation list, if you happen to have that? And to even think about those things. And these type of things seem like they are insignificant, but all of these things actually begin to create a story for people around their racial formation, because you can ask the same set of questions to different people, particularly people of color, and there could be different responses. And so what happens then is that we have college campuses and we have students, faculty, and staff that have very different perspectives. And having a different perspective is one thing, but to have a very different reality and understanding of the complexity of race as one experiences it in their residential life, as one experiences it in their classroom, as one experiences it working within the university context, to have that, and then to have people that are in key leadership roles that have gaps that are too far from those individuals that they work with and they have beloved relationships with, but do not have enough understanding, is actually the work that I think that so many of our leaders need to do. And to be quite honest, if you look at the leadership from what ACE, American Council on Education, has been reporting for years on the leadership of American colleges and universities, it has not changed dramatically. It's pretty close to corporate America. It is still predominantly white and it's still predominantly male, even though there has been some significant wins, particularly with new President Drake will begin his work as the first African American leading the University of California to take the place after Janet Napolitano. So we are seeing some things happening, and particularly over the last 5 to 7 years, but we're nowhere near to where our campuses are right now in regard to who's showing up on our campuses. And so there is this significant, it's not just a gap in some of our institutions, it's like a ocean between what the campus leaders really understand. I'm not talking about their statements, because anyone can write a really lovely statement around their commitment to these ideas of diversity, equity, inclusion, or their commitment to these ideas of anti-racism. But do they really know what anti-racism means? Do they really know that? And if they just learned it, even recently, just imagine all the years of their living that they have not had the same perspective as many of their faculty, staff, and students who come from diverse backgrounds have. And so what I'm telling folks is that this is a time that there is a significant learning curve for many smart people that are leading universities around racial equity, meaning that there is a racial illiteracy. Now, this is me completely speaking based upon my experience. And Drum, I've been in higher education, in a California context now. I think this is my 27th year. I can say this for sure because I sit on boards and I lead not only where I'm located in the San Francisco Bay Area, but I do a lot of national work. And I can tell you for sure, based upon my observation and my training and my own lived experience, there is a significant racial illiteracy among the American university presidency right now, meaning that they're not quite equipped, the majority of them, to respond to the issues and needs that are at our doorsteps. And that gap is where people like myself and others are trying to not only sound the alarm, but also to say, this is what happens when you don't have representation. You don't have representation in the, they talk about representation in the professorate, but what about representation in the presidency? You don't have representation in the presidency, then you're going to have an inadequate response because of the things that I've stated before.
Well, it makes perfect sense. It goes back to what we were talking about before we came on the podcast. Unless you've walked a mile in my shoes, how do you know me? You really don't. So how can university presidents help themselves and get that understanding that they need to have, that it's so critical not only for themselves, but for their institutions as well?
Well, the first thing is to continue to understand the root problem. That's what I attempted to do at the beginning of our time together, is to understand the root causes of racism in America that has found the issue at their doorsteps of their university, to become students of understanding the Black experience in the United States, to get a true and accurate knowledge of that experience beyond a cursory understanding. And anybody that's leading a university, if they did not have to be a history major, they do not have to be a sociology major, they do not need to be a legal scholar, but they do need to have a better grasp of these issues than the average person on the street. They need to be able to talk about these issues with some sense of urgency, as well as because they're leaders, because they're presidents, they got to be able to talk about it with some level of command, because their students, faculty, and staff are actually expecting them to have some command on their knowledge around these issues of racial equity. So the first thing that presidents got to do, they got to up their game. They got to up their racial equity, their racial justice education. And whether that takes time reading, there's lots of books to read. There's a lot of documentaries, but they've got to spend summer of 2020, while they're also trying to deal with the financial crisis, they have got to put the same efforts as they're doing with the financial crisis on this racial crisis and get up to speed on their race education, particularly in a U.S. context, to understand the racial climate on their campuses and to connect that racial climate on their campuses to the racial climate in the United States, knowing that those two things are not separate. The other thing that they need to do is that while they're working on themselves, they need to evaluate their inner circle, oftentimes called their cabinet. They need to see to what degree are they living out the mission of the statements that they say are so important to them. I think every president has written an important anti-racist statement to support, to denounce issues such as, the loss of Black lives, and to support the efforts to create a more equal and just world. The next step in that, if they haven't already done that, is that they need to evaluate their own teams, evaluate how they're living it out themselves. Have they expressed their commitment to the demands of equity and inclusion by ensuring that they have representation on their own teams, in their cabinet? And that not only includes, people who do diversity work, that's just one part of it, but have they, looked at other key areas of the institution, whether it be business and finance, communications and marketing, development, and obviously academic affairs, just to name a few, to see where have they not met their duty to ensure that there's representation of diverse people, basically, does their cabinet look just like them? And if their cabinet overwhelmingly, particularly if they're white identified, and they overwhelmingly continues to be the same, then they continue to be part of the problem. They're not leading in the moment. This moment is asking for, and it's more than a moment, but this is what it's asking for presidents to do better. And then the third thing that I think they have to do is that they have to continue to work with students, faculty, and staff who have deep knowledge in this particular area, who's on their campuses. They're going to be faculty that have deep knowledge, as well as students and staff, to really look at ways in which they need to become an anti-racist university, an anti-racist campus. What are the assets that they already have in place? Who can help lead the campus in this work? What alumni can help lead the campus in the work? Pull together an anti-racist brain trust that can be also an advisor to the president and an advisor to the leadership on what is the curriculum and the co-curriculum, as well as other business or other practices that needs to be looked at through the lens and framework of becoming anti-racist. And so those are just three things that I would suggest. But you notice that I start off with the individual, because I really believe that this is a time that leaders are being called to higher calling. Leadership has never been an easy gig, and rightly so, because it's a privilege to lead. And even during times that seems difficult, even painful, it still is a privilege to lead, because people will look to those that are in these key roles for guidance. They're looking for modeling. They're looking for individuals who have their finger on the pulse and can lead the university community to a place of, even though as difficult it is, we have a vision about who we are and who we are becoming. And we need people that can communicate that. So much of this work is really about the individual leaders themselves, because when they really become transformed in understanding their own racialized perspectives and the gaps that they may have, and they begin to work earnestly with a sense of urgency around responding to, what have I not learned? Can you imagine somebody with a PhD or an MD or these degrees behind their names, a JD, to come to a place and they're already a president and they have to answer this question, which I'm saying they have to ask themselves in the quiet of their own hearts, what have I not learned about around racial equity? What do I not know that could be holding me back? And then if it's holding me back, it's impacting my leadership. And if it's impacting my leadership, then it's actually holding the university back, And so, that's the kind of trusted DEI coaching, I call it diversity, equity, coaching that someone like me does, with people who are very close to, who trust me. I've heard from a couple of people that lead some significant organizations that called me in the days after slaying of Mr. George Floyd in Minneapolis. And they said, can I just talk to you? And this is really vulnerable for me, but I'm so ashamed that I didn't know enough about this. And they carry quite significant titles. And I felt a sense of empathy with them, and told them that, that we all have to do better, but I didn't let them off the hook. I said, I think the reason why you called me, because that I'm going to tell you that you have to do better because you have this job. And they're like, I know.
It's like, from Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step is realizing you have a problem. And until you come out of denial, then you're never going to make any changes.
Yeah. That is definitely true.
And I go back to, it's either Maslow or one of those folks who talks about the 4 levels of learning. You have the unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious competence.
Yes.
And so many people with these events with George Floyd and others are coming out of unconscious incompetence, getting to that conscious incompetence, going, this doesn't feel good. We need to do better. We need to understand why people are the way that they are so that we can meet them where they are and help pull them forward, or at least give them the road to where they can pull themselves forward.
Yeah, and I really do like the term unconscious incompetence, because this is the thing. Here's where the rubber meets the road on this. University leaders are not going to be given many passes going forward on their unconscious incompetence. That's just kind of like the short way of just naming the truth. And if some of them are scared, they should be scared, because they're not going to get a pass. They say the wrong thing, not just out of a gotcha, because I don't like those gotcha cultures, because I don't think that doesn't help our students. It doesn't help any of us, because we have to have a sense of care and a sense of mercy as we're all learning to become the higher versions of ourselves. Yet there is something to be said about this kind of overt unconscious incompetence, in that the students particularly, and in some cases, younger staff and younger faculty, and it doesn't just mean the younger folks, but they just definitely have a higher sense of what I've seen, because I've been in higher ed a long time, so I've been involved in enough junior higher faculty hires, as well as younger professionals that are coming up in the higher ed profession. What I am seeing among them, and then of course the students, what I am seeing among them, those individuals, is a way in which there is an expectation that if you're going to assume a leadership role, and assume the rights and the privileges that go with it, that then there is a higher responsibility around this area of understanding racial injustice. And that because there has been so many demonstrations, and because even after the University of Missouri, the Mizzou situation, and then we talked about that the last time you and I were together, this generation, these two generations that are coming up, that are on our campuses, whether they're students or they're employees as faculty and staff, they're saying, you've had enough time to figure this out. You had enough time to educate yourself. We've had enough time to get up to speed on the injustices that are happening in our institutions. How could one become a fully formed adult leading an institution with X amount of budget and people and responsibility, with all the town and gown and other responsibilities, and that know about institutionalized racism in America? They're just not having it. They said that it's not acceptable. And so where the rubber meets the road now is that all university leaders at the highest rung actually can no longer hide behind their ignorance. Their ignorance actually, in some cases, if it's misplaced what they write, if it's misplaced what they say, it's misplaced on the decision that they make, it can be a significant cost on their campuses. So the stakes are high is all I'm saying, Drum. The stakes are high for everyone, but the stakes are high for leaders to get this racial equity piece right.
As it should be. As I tell some of my colleagues, when the divine wants your attention, he taps you on your shoulder, and then he shakes your shoulder a little bit until you finally, if you're not waking up, he takes a 2x4 and hits you between the eyes. And frankly, that's what's happened, is we've got the 2x4 at this point. And it's time for us to do something that's been long overdue.
Yes.
I mean, we take a look at the women and the right to vote. there's still issues with pay equity. I mean, it's even worse for Black faculty members and Black employees. So, it's something that we all need to learn. I wish we had more time, because I think we could probably talk for 3 or 4 more hours.
Yes.
But 3 quick takeaways for university presidents. What do they got to focus on now, and what do they need to focus on going forward?
I think the questions that university presidents, in addition to the financial crisis that we're all experiencing in various forms, that we have to look at the ways in which COVID-19 has exposed the racial inequities in all areas of our lives, not just the health outcomes, but in all areas. And so university presidents have got to focus on racial equity, and not just social equity. They have to focus on racial equity. They have to be specific by using the term race and racial or racism in their language, in what they write and what they talk about. Now is a time for specificity around race. So that's the first thing. The second thing they need to do is, as they are, again, trying to figure out how to navigate and negotiate the disruption that is currently continues to happen in higher education now with the COVID-19, they cannot put this issue of race on the back burner and try to put it against economic concerns. That we have an economic crisis, a health crisis, and we have a racial crisis. And because we're in an economic crisis, we may be tempted to put aside this issue and try to stratify them as one being more important. And what my advisement and guidance to leaders who are listening is that you cannot separate the two. You have to, if you look at it through a racial equity framework and a racial equity lens, which is my first guidance, then my second guidance would be then, as you are dealing with all of the issues that's on the plate right now, as from reopening campus to everything, you have to also look at it from a racial equity lens. So those two things have to go hand in hand, because that'll determine how you go about even responding to the economic and other crises, if you're looking at it through a racial equity lens. And then the last thing, if you haven't already done so, really make some commitments to who it is that you have brought into the core of who runs the institution, and even more so who's in your kind of inner circle. And if you don't have a person of color, if you don't have a Black identified person, if you don't have a woman of color, if you don't, now would be a good time to hire a Black woman.
Are you looking?
No, I'm just saying now would be a good time to hire an Indigenous woman. Now would be a good time to hire a Latinx woman. Now is a good time for presidents, if you do not have those people working directly with you, because they have their lived experiences that will be helpful to how the university and helpful to the president and how he, she, or they kind of move forward. So those are just some thoughts I have.
Well, yeah, and they make perfect sense, especially the last one. It's not from an appearance perspective. It's from an understanding perspective.
Absolutely. How can you respond to an array of issues if you don't have people that are in the core leadership that understand it? We wouldn't go out and do anything without getting the right resources gathered, And so why would we try to run an institution during a racial epidemic and not have the right people around us?
Yeah, I'm gonna be a little bit irreverent at this point, but the quote from Forrest Gump comes to mind: "Stupid is as stupid does. Let's not be stupid."
Absolutely. Higher education is been a gift to so many.
Everybody.
And everybody. And we have both a duty and a responsibility because of what we represent. And now this is a time that the nation and the world needs the American university and college post-secondary institutions dramatically. And so we have to do everything we can to not only protect what we've had before from a perspective of our missions, but we actually have to get bolder and we have to get bigger in regard to responding to what the demands of our lifetimes are right now. And we are being demanded to do better.
Yeah. We need to heal as an individual, as an institution, and as a country. And there's no way to heal without going through the problem. You can't avoid it. You can't walk away from it. The only healing is by embracing it, making the necessary changes, and then we all can look back and say, we've done this and we did it right. Yeah, we got off to the wrong start the way it was done, dating back many, many centuries to 1619. But that doesn't negate the good that is in everyone, and they just need to recognize what that good is and how to be good in a different way.
Yes. And to use one's platform for good.
Absolutely. It is a privilege to lead an institution. And we used to have a saying in the Navy, RHIP, rank has its privileges. Well, the corollary to that is rank has its responsibilities.
Absolutely.
And this is one of those responsibilities whose time is nigh.
Yeah. And this is a time of all of those individuals that are in these key roles, such as presidents and the people who report to them. This is a time of leadership.
Step up. Another saying, lead, follow, or get out of the way. Well, you're in the position, it's time to lead.
Yes.
And so Mary, what's next for you?
Oh, wow. I'm responding to so many things as we're trying to understand what does anti-racist universities look like. I'm involved in the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities. We're pulling together all 28 campuses around what does that mean for us. And I think that those campuses are a great place, to focus efforts on because of our collective Jesuit mission. We really think about race and reconciliation. And how do we, as a group, go about reconciling ourselves to all forms of institutionalized racism? And so I'm pleased to be a part of that work because I think, like I said, all platforms are important. And I think that's a critical platform because some good stuff could come out of that type of initiative, our Race and Reconciliation Initiative. And the rest of it is just to continue, just doing this work and doing it in a way, I released my book. There's been interest around that. I get inquiries every week from people that are reading it or from some companies. They're saying that we would like to buy a couple hundred for all our employees. I said, that's great. And maybe I get a chance to say, I really love to speak with you. So that's what I'm trying to do, trying to speak to people. And then at the last is, I'm prayerful, in my own discernment, at such a time as this, both you and I are here, we're walking the earth and we have great capacities, so my discernment is that I want to be used in a way that can make a difference. And so that's where my thoughts and my prayers are always at, I just want to make a difference. There's a reason that I'm here. There's a reason that we're all here now during this this highly unusual but yet opportunist time.
Absolutely. And so thank you so much for coming back on the show. As always, it's a pleasure having you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for calling me again. Yes, and we'll get through another year and then maybe we can check in again.
That'd be great.
All right, then you take care, John.
And you too. Thank you again. Thanks for listening this week. And a special thank you to this week's special guest, Dr. Mary Wardell-Ghirarduzzi, the Vice Provost and Chief Diversity Officer for the University of San Francisco, and for her sharing her insights on the importance of and how to achieve diversity inclusion in today's higher education environment. I also want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, Blackbaud. Visit blackbaud.com/highered to learn about their cloud fundraising, accounting, education management, scholarship, and analytics solutions that are powering some of higher ed's top institutions. Our next guest is Dr. Tony Allen, who's the president of Delaware State University. Tony will be joining us to talk about their recent acquisition of Wesley College, a private liberal arts college in Dover, Delaware. I don't know about you, but I need a break from COVID, risk management plans, and the craziness of the world. So hearing from Tony on a topic such as mergers will be a welcome relief. See you next week, and in the meantime, stay safe and healthy.
This episode of Changing Higher Ed was brought to you by Blackbaud, the world's leading cloud software company powering social good. Be sure to visit blackbaud.com/highered to learn how they can help your institution deliver a better experience from admissions to advancement. Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.